Because the NFL draft was this past weekend and Caleb Williams, a quarterback, went number 1 overall, I decided to rank all 27 quarterbacks since 1970 to be drafted first overall based on how their careers went. I'm honestly surprised I haven't done this video yet, but there's a first time for everything. So sit back, relax, and enjoy, and please watch. There are 2 quarterbacks picked first overall that I want to put in the too soon to tell category. The first one is Bryce Young, although I'm pretty sure he sucks and is going to be a draft bust. But I'm going to be fair, it was rookie season. Only 1 year. I need a bigger sample size, even though I do not have any faith in him turning it around. He belongs in this tier. And also Trevor Lawrence. This is really a make or break year for Lawrence. If he has another mediocre season, then I think it's time for everybody to finally admit that he's not the generational quarterback that everybody thought he was coming out of Clemson. I know he had that comeback playoff win in 2022 versus the Chargers, but other than that, his career has been very disappointing thus far. But it's too soon to call him a bust. So now let's get to the actual rankings. There's 25 quarterbacks who were picked first overall, not including Caleb Williams, of course. Let's start with the bottom of the worst, the bottom of the barrel. And obviously, Jamarcus Russell is number 1 there. This guy was picked first overall. He played 3 seasons with the Raiders. 18 touchdowns, 23 interceptions, plenty of weight issues and problems. His stats are terrible. His win-loss record was terrible. Everything about him was terrible. He's arguably the biggest draft bust of all time, along with Ryan Leaf. So that's an easy selection. David Carr. Now, David Carr, I think, has kind of been forgotten about because you see people mix him and his brother Derek all the time. But for all of Derek Carr's faults, at least he actually is a somewhat decent quarterback. David Carr was not. David Carr was dog shit. And I understand that he was drafted to a new franchise with Houston, but he just wasn't very good. He wasn't good at all, and the stats show that. And he held on to the ball too long, which is the result of a lot of his sacks that he had. Now, people blame his offensive line. And again, I'm not saying that he had a great offensive line, but he was definitely not a guy who got the ball out quick. He couldn't really read defense as well. He was just a waste of a first overall pick. Then we get to Tim Couch. Tim Couch is very similar to David Carr statistically. Carr had 65 touchdowns and 71 picks, 74.9 rating. Tim Couch, on the other hand, had 64 touchdowns and 67 picks with a 75.1 rating, although Couch came a little bit earlier into the NFL 99, whereas David Carr was 2002. I think in an alternate dimension, if Couch wasn't selected, like Carr, to a new franchise, I think he probably could have been decent, but he had injuries and everything kind of just went south for him and unraveled for him, and he just had a lot of bad luck. I don't think, maybe I'm just a Tim Couch truther, I don't know, but I do think there was a situation where he could have become a good NFL quarterback, but it certainly wasn't with the expansion Browns. A lot of the excuses that people make for David Carr about the expansion Texans, those actually apply to Tim Couch with the expansion Browns. I think Tim Couch could have been a good quarterback, but as it stands, his career was extremely disappointing. Move on now to Sammy Sleeves Bradford. Now, Bradford, I don't know, it's kind of like people really didn't talk about him as a bust during his career, which was weird. I think because he always had a bunch of money and he was always signing big contracts. Like Sam Bradford's agent is literally God, considering the fact that he continued to get Bradford paid shitloads amount of money, despite the fact that Bradford never did anything except get injured consistently and get picked first overall, which is why teams kept giving him chance after chance. Bradford finished his career with 103 touchdowns to 61 interceptions, 84.5 rating. Was he the worst quarterback ever? No. But for a quarterback picked first overall, he literally did nothing. So he's here. Moving on, we got Jameis Winston. Now, Jameis Winston is actually somewhat kind of tough to gauge because he has 141 touchdowns, 99 interceptions, a career 87 rating. He's always going to be known for the 30-30 season he had in 2019. But for a guy who has shown flashes of legit elite play, he wasn't able to sustain it. And whenever he has a great half or a quarter or two where he throws 2 or 3 touchdowns, you just know that another 2 or 3 interception half or game is waiting right on deck. He's so volatile. And when you're the first overall pick, obviously, the team that you're drafting or drafted you is looking for consistency. And it's safe to say that the Bucs never got that with Winston, although he does have an incredible 76 adjusted net yards per attempt in the playoffs because his only career playoff pass attempt came in 2020 versus Tom Brady's Bucs on a trick play where he threw for a long touchdown. So I guess he has that to hold on to, but his regular season career for the first overall pick has been extremely disappointing. Fast forward to Jeff George. Jeff George is one of the weirdest and toughest careers to evaluate because with the team that drafted him, the Colts, first overall in 1990, he spent 4 years there. He was dog shit, lost a lot of games. His stats were terrible. But then he went to Atlanta, and he had a couple good years. But then they let him go because he was a locker room distraction. Then he goes to Oakland, has another great year in 97. They let him go eventually in 98. Then he goes to Minnesota, has a great year in 99, leads him to the playoffs. And then he spends a couple years in Washington to end his career. So this was a guy who he got tossed around a lot, but he did show the potential to have some really good seasons, and his stats were actually not that bad, especially after he left Indiana. But he never won anything. His teams were consistently losers outside of 1999. So I don't think that he was a great quarterback by any means, but I don't think that he warrants the draft bust label, because he did have at least 2 or 3 seasons where he was actually one of the better quarterbacks in the league. Move down to Steve Bartkowski. We go back a couple decades for Jeff George. Jeff George was a 90s baby. Steve Bartkowski was in the 70s and 80s, and his early career was extremely rough. In some ways, it kind of parallels to Alex Smith, a guy who you pick first overall. Everyone's expecting the world of you, and you just completely fall flat on your face. Now, Alex Smith eventually righted the ship, and I think Steve Bartkowski was kind of a precedent to Smith, where his first couple years were so terrible, but he eventually ended up becoming a Pro Bowler. He ended up leading the Falcons to the playoffs a couple times, and he ended up with some pretty good stats for the 70s and 80s. He finished with 156 touchdowns and 144 interceptions, but he never won anything, so I think this is a really good placement for him on the list. Next up is Vinny Testaverde. Vinny Testaverde was honestly one of the weirdest and toughest spots for me in this video, because he ended up with 275 touchdowns. He threw for over 46,000 yards, but he was a journeyman. He had a couple good seasons, especially in 1998, sprinkled in for his long career, but he was never an elite quarterback. Now, I will say he was drafted to the absolutely terrible Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, he was drafted to the Buccaneers the year after they finally let Steve Young go, and they traded Steve Young to the 49ers. And Steve Young, who obviously we all know is one of the best quarterbacks ever and a first ballot Hall of Famer, I do wonder, what if Vinny Testaverde had been traded to the 49ers instead, and he'd been able to take over that team that Steve Young took over? Would he be considered as a Hall of Famer instead? I don't know. I do think that once he left Tampa, his numbers became better, and he did have a respectable career. But I think when you're looking, again, when you're talking about the first overall pick in a draft, you're looking for a superstar. And outside of maybe 98, Vinny was never really a superstar. He just played for a very long time. Then we get to Jim Plunkett. On regular season stats alone, Jim Plunkett is way down on this list. But the reason Jim Plunkett is this high on this list, despite never making any Pro Bowls, is because he does have 2 Super Bowl rings, and his playoff numbers were very, very good. He does have a Super Bowl MVP, and as much as we like to ignore it, that actually does matter at the end of the day. So Jim Plunkett, first overall pick, he couldn't cut it with the Patriots, he couldn't cut it with the 49ers, but he did find a home eventually with the Raiders, and that's where he won 2 Super Bowls. So respect to him for having the balls to do well in the postseason. Next up, Kyler Murray. I honestly don't know what to make of Kyler Murray. I feel like his highlights are as good as anybody, but at the same time, he hasn't won anything. He's been in the league now for 5 years. He's made 1 playoff appearance, and in that 1 playoff appearance, he got the crap out of him, and he played terrible. So the question is, what really is Kyler Murray good, or is he just held back by the Cardinals' incompetence? I feel like a lot of people are still trying to figure that out. It's obvious he has talent, but I don't really know exactly how much of it is he just has flaws as a quarterback. He's like, what, 6 foot tall? He's a fucking tiny guy. Who knows? I mean, he's kind of fun to watch because when he runs, he has his little tiny legs moving 1,000 miles an hour. It's pretty hilarious. But other than that, I would say he's pretty mid. I don't think he's certainly not a terrible player, but I would think if you ask the Arizona front office, if you put them all on truth serum and you said, hey, would you expect Kyler to be further along in his development at this point of his career? Because this is going to be his 6th season, entering his 6th season in the league in 2024. I'm sure all of them would say yes, but he's still not a bad quarterback, but could do better. We go to Baker Mayfield, another former Oklahoma product under Lincoln Riley. It's kind of hilarious how similar Murray and Mayfield's stats are. They both have an adjusted net yards per attempt of 6.02, and Baker's kind of a guy, he's one of those quarterbacks that'll have a good season, then a bad season, good season, bad season, peaks and valleys, and he just came off of a really good season when it looked like his career was at the wit's end. He with the Buccaneers, he ended up throwing for over 4,000 yards, made the Pro Bowl for the first time in his career, won a playoff game, so he has shown at various points throughout his career of being actually a very good quarterback, but then just when you start to buy into him, he has a stinker of a season or he gets traded. It's just it's one of those things, again, where if you're the first overall pick, you're expected to be a superstar, and Baker's definitely not a superstar, but he's not a terrible quarterback, at least most of the time, so he kind of falls in the middle of this list. I think this is a pretty good placement for him. This next one might be controversial, but Michael Vick, the name and the brand is a lot bigger and a lot more prominent than Michael Vick quarterback. Now, we all know know about his dogfighting stuff, but if you just look about his actual on-field production, he was never a great passer outside of really 2010 when he went with Philly and Andy Reid. And especially when he was in Atlanta, he never threw for 3,000 yards in a season. His completion percentage was always dog shit. He was always a fantastic runner. He's probably the second greatest running quarterback of all time behind Lamar Jackson. But he was always a very, very bad passer, and he never really improved. And that's why, despite the off-field stuff that we all know about, I think that the Falcons obviously made the right decision going with Matt Ryan in 2008. But really, outside of 2002 and 2010, Mike Vick never really had any great years throwing the ball or respectable seasons throwing the ball. But he does get this high because he is a legendary running quarterback and a legendary rushing threat. MVP runner-up in 2004, although the fact that he did get a vote over Peyton Manning that year is literally a crime against humanity. Never made a Super Bowl, made one conference championship game, which he lost to my Eagles, thank you. So this is about where he belongs, even though if you just look at his name in terms of impact, he might be a lot higher, but in terms of actual game and how he performed on the field in the National Football League, this is where he belongs. Next up is Alex Smith, and I said earlier, Alex Smith began his career, really the first 6 years of his career, 05 to 2010, he was a draft bust, and he was a terrible player, and it was so bad that I do remember the game. Again, my Eagles were playing in San Fran in 2010. It got so bad with Alex Smith that the 49ers fans were chanting for David Carr, who was also on the 2010 49ers. Now, Jim Harbaugh then became head coach in 2011, and it seemed to turn Smith's career around, and he became a play-it-safe game manager, but he also won a shitload of games in the regular season, and he had very good stats from 2011 onward, and obviously we all know about the serious injuries he had, but he was a guy who you could win a lot of games with under the right situations, but he was never a great quarterback. He was never an elite quarterback, but he was a very good quarterback to good quarterback for a few years, which, considering how his career started out, I think he threw 1 touchdown to 11 interceptions as a rookie. I mean, he was very, very bad. He missed an entire season early on in 2008 with a shoulder injury. I mean, he really bounced back, and this is even before all of his terrible injuries. He really bounced back from a lot of uphill battles early on, so congrats to him. So for him ranking this high on this list is actually a pretty big accomplishment. And also shout out to him for calling out how shitty the AFC East was in Tom Brady's era. Not a lot of people in the media have the balls to do that. Next up, speaking of Tom Brady, is Drew Bledsoe. Now, we all know Drew Bledsoe, it's somewhat of a shame because Drew Bledsoe, no matter what he does, is always going to be most known for Mo Lewis hitting him out of bounds and fucking basically tearing up his insides, making him bleed internally, which opened the door for Tom Brady for 2 decades of terror. But Bledsoe, he finished with over 44,000 passing yards, 251 touchdowns. He was kind of a Matthew Stafford-esque player where a lot of volume, quality came and went, but more of a quantity over quality guy. But he was a guy, he had games where he threw 70 passes in a game. He was a guy that he was, your textbook 6'4", big arm, tall quarterback that all the scouts drooled over. And he had a couple really good seasons early on. But he also, again, I've said this before, but he was tied for the most touchdown passes in the 2001 playoffs for the 2001 Super Bowl champion New England Patriots. He had as many touchdown passes as Tom Brady did, just so you don't know. But he was never a very high efficiency guy. So, but I think his raw numbers are still, you look at him like, wow, that was actually pretty good for a guy who's most remembered for being Wally pipped by Tom Brady. Next, we go to Carson Palmer, who's kind of in the same boat as Bledsoe, although Bledsoe was lucky enough to get a Super Bowl ring out of his injury and Tom Brady replacing him. And also Tony Romo for Bledsoe. But Carson Palmer was a guy who, he had over 46,000 yards, 294 touchdown passes, 187 interceptions. Carson Palmer was a guy who was a textbook fine quarterback, who occasionally would sprinkle in an elite season. When he first started out, he was drafted first overall in 03. He sat the entire year. 04 is his redshirt rookie season. He wasn't great. But then in 05, he had one of the best seasons in the league, and he had the Bengals in the playoffs. And of course, we all remember he blew his knee out after the first throw on the game. And for whatever reason, he kind of lost himself a little bit, was never as good with the Bengals and the Raiders, the next team he played for, as he was in 05. But then he goes back to Arizona. He has Bruce Arians, and they seem to have figured something out. He tore his ACL again in 2014. And then in 2015, he has arguably the best season in the league, a decade after tearing up the league in 05. So a very weird career for Carson Palmer. But you look at his numbers and his efficiency, like in 2005 and 2015, he was arguably the MVP, best player in the league or best quarterback in the league. But a lot of kind of just mediocre seasons in between. So very weird career. I would say that based on where the Bengals drafted him, I think that he only lasted there for 7-8 years, never won a playoff game. So in that sense, I guess he might be a disappointment. But if you look at his overall production, he's certainly not a disappointment. Next, we get to Jared Goff. Now, Jared Goff is a weird one because he's a guy who he's been to a Super Bowl. He was one game away from a second Super Bowl appearance this year, and he seems to have found a second wind with his career with the Detroit Lions. And it's like good for him, because a lot of people, including me, just thought that he was a product of Sean McVay. Remember, he had that terrible rookie season in 2016. It was historically bad. Sean McVay comes in, all of a sudden Goff's throwing for 4,000 yards, and then by year 2 under McVay, they're reaching the Super Bowl, and of course they only put up 3 points versus Tom Brady's Patriots, which pisses me off. But anyway, so Goff was making Pro Bowls, and everyone said, oh, well, it's all because of Sean McVay. And so eventually, after a couple lean years, he gets traded to the Lions, and everyone says, oh, well, this is going to be a stopgap type of thing, and he ends up eventually leading the Lions to the NFC Championship game for the first time since 1991, and putting up great numbers, and he seems to have found a home in Detroit. So when you really look at his career, he's had a pretty good career, but the lows have been very, very low. We go to Cam Newton next, and Cam Newton, basically, he won an MVP, he made a Super Bowl appearance, he is a shitload of rushing touchdowns, and the thing with Cam was he was never a great passer, didn't have great efficiency numbers, but outside of a few years, his teams really didn't do well in the win-loss column, but when he was at his best, he was better than a lot of people, so he gets here. If he was able to have beaten that legendary Broncos defense in Super Bowl 50, he would be a lot higher, but unfortunately, that was his moment in the spotlight, and he had a chance to really, really further his legacy, and he didn't come through. So he lands here, even though he was a force on the ground to be reckoned with. He was never a great passer. After him, we got Andrew Luck. Now, Andrew Luck, if you're talking about just pure ability, Andrew Luck would be in the top 2 or 3, but he decided to retire. His playoff numbers weren't as good as you would expect for a person as hyped up as he was, so he ends up here. But Andrew Luck, in terms of everything you're looking for in a quarterback, height, speed, weight, arm strength, before the arm surgeries, he had everything. That's why he was such a highly touted recruit. He had everything. So he probably would have been a Hall of Famer if he hadn't retired early, so he gets here. Joe Burrow. Now, Joe Burrow, I have my criticisms of him for being overrated as a clutch player, for not producing anything in the fourth quarter, especially in Super Bowl 56 and in the 2022 AFC Championship game versus the Chiefs. But he has single-handedly, really, not single-handedly, but Jamar Chase and a bunch of other guys. But Joe Burrow has been the catalyst for turning the Cincinnati Bengals from a laughingstock into a contender and respectability. So there aren't a lot of players who could do that, so he gets here, even though he kind of gets treated as a quarterback that has 2 or 3 Super Bowl rings, even though he's never won a Super Bowl ring. That's where he lands. Next up, Eli Manning. Now, Eli, I mean, I could spend about 15 minutes debating whether or not he's a Hall of Famer. The fact is, he has 2 Super Bowls, 2 Super Bowl MVPs. A lot of that belongs to his defense shutting down historic Patriots offenses. If the Patriots offenses in 07 and 2011, if they had produced at their normal levels in the Super Bowls that they played against Eli would have lost. He never produced more than 20 points in any Super Bowl that he played in. So his defense deserves a massive amount of credit. He never won a playoff game outside of 2007 or 2011. So really, his Hall of Fame case is being a mediocre quarterback and a compiler who had 2 really good playoff runs thanks to his defense stepping up. But at the same time, there are a lot of first overall picks that weren't able to do that, so he gets here. At the end of the day, he has 2 Super Bowls and 2 Super Bowl MVPs, so he does end up here, even though I don't think he was a great quarterback. Now we go to Troy Aikman. Troy Aikman is such a very, very interesting guy and a very weird career, because you look at his raw numbers, you think this guy sucks ass. But from 92 to 95, especially in the postseason, this guy for a 4-year stretch had one of the best 4-year stretches in the postseason of any quarterback ever. Won 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, made the NFC Championship game all 4 years in a row. Now, I understand he had a loaded supporting cast around him, but he was consistent as fuck for those 4 years, and a big reason why the Cowboys were able to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. So I do think his ranking here is warranted. You know, do I think if he was drafted by a bad team, or if he had been on a bad team for most of his career? Obviously, the Cowboys turned it around pretty quickly after his rookie and second seasons in the league with the trade from the Herschel Walker trade. But I don't think on his own he might have been a great quarterback, but he did produce at a super high level for 3 Super Bowl runs, and there aren't a lot of first overall picks that can say that. Really, there aren't a lot of quarterbacks in general who can say that. So he lands here, despite the fact that his numbers might leave something to be desired. At number 3, we go Matt Stafford. Now, Matt Stafford is one of the weirdest careers ever. Outside of 2021, he's never won a playoff game, but his playoff numbers are really, really good. Even if you exclude 2021, he's obviously won a Super Bowl. He is very similar to Drew Bledsoe in that he has a lot of seasons that were high quantity, but not quality. He's basically like a pitcher that'll throw 200 innings, but give you a somewhat close to 4.00 ERA. He's not going to be an elite pitcher, but he eats innings up. That's kind of what Matthew Stafford is. But the reason I rank Stafford this high is because he does have that Super Bowl ring. He does have the counting stats to go with it, and he's not done yet, so we don't know what's going to happen. I think obviously he was drafted to an 0-16 team, so had he been drafted to a better team at a younger age as opposed to joining the Rams in their super team in 2021, who knows how he could have done. But I think as it stands, Super Bowl champion with the amount of stats he has, I think he belongs at number 3 on this list. Some people may disagree, but I don't give a shit. Third, we got Terry Bradshaw. Now, Terry Bradshaw is another guy who his regular season numbers, just looking at them on the surface, are not very good. He has just 2 more touchdowns and interceptions, but this guy was drafted in 1970. He played till 1983. After the rules in 1978 loosened up the defensive ability to hold receivers as they were going out for pass patterns, he ended up winning an MVP. He made a couple Pro Bowls. He won 2 Super Bowl MVPs. Now, and I've said this before, but I think because he has played the dumb country bumpkin role on TV for so long, people have just kind of accepted that he was a dumbass and didn't know what he was doing. But I don't think that's true. If you look at the Super Bowl numbers were excellent, especially in the fourth quarter. They were off the charts. And for all the talk about the steel curtain, if it wasn't for Bradshaw's clutch fourth quarter performances, they probably don't win in 1978 and 1979. So Bradshaw, his playoff numbers for his era were great. He won an MVP. He's a lot better than he might let you on to believe. Number 2, John Elway. So John Elway is basically the prodigal son. He was the greatest prospect ever coming out of Stanford, and to this day, people are still kind of divisive on John Elway because they look at his numbers, especially from his first 10 seasons, and they say, well, this, people who were too young to watch Elway play, they look at his career numbers from 83 to 92, and they say, my God, this guy sucked. He was average. I mean, statistically, he was comparable to a guy like Kerry Collins for his first 10 seasons, and that's adjusting for era. Yet he went to 3 Super Bowls in that time. He had very good playoff numbers, and of course, as we all know, he ended up winning 2 Super Bowls, largely because he had a great running back in Terrell Davis, and it wasn't as if he carried anything, but he did win 2 Super Bowls. He won a Super Bowl MVP. The basic thing about John Elway is people said, well, imagine if he had had more support around him from earlier in his career, he would have been by far the GOAT, but we don't know that for sure. At the end of the day, he lands here at number 2 because number 1 is Peyton Manning, which is an easy decision. Peyton Manning's by far the best number 1 pick at the quarterback position ever. 5 MVPs, 7 first-team All-Pros. He was so unbelievably consistent in the regular season. There's not even a debate, in my opinion, as opposed to he's probably one of the 3 or 4 best quarterbacks ever, regardless of draft selection. He single-handedly made the Chiefs from a laughingstock to a respected organization, and even still to this day, I think some people still associate the Chiefs with Peyton Manning, and they wonder why the Chiefs aren't as good because Peyton Manning used to play for him. He went to Denver and also produced massive numbers there and proved that he wasn't just a guy who had great receivers in Indy like Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne and Dallas Clark. Basically, Peyton Manning was situation-proof. No matter what situation you put him in, he was going to put up massive numbers. And although for his 2 Super Bowl rings, he might have had bad numbers along the runs for those Super Bowl rings, you can make a very good argument that there is no one player more valuable throughout the history of the National Football League than Peyton Manning for how consistent he was in the regular season. And that's why he gets the number 1 pick in my best number 1 overall quarterback picks video.